We're so happy that you're all here with us this evening. And we're very excited for our presentation this evening, The Intersection of Trauma and Racism, with Dr. Nicole Christian Brathwaite.
Thank you again, everyone, for having me. Tonight, the goal is to have a very in-depth discussion in a very short amount of time. So the one takeaway I would have is that we are barely scratching the surface. This is just the beginning of the conversation. And if you are an educator, if you are someone that works with children, I will certainly provide these slides to Lesley University so they can share them with you. And there are a number of resources at the end. And I would strongly encourage you to look into these resources and do a lot of your own research and studying after. So before we really get started, and if you've ever been to any of my talks, I always start with some kind of mindfulness activity. And as we'll talk about, trauma disconnects our thinking, logical, planning part of our brain. Mindfulness reconnects that part of our brain. And mindfulness doesn't have to be just sitting still and breathing. Mindfulness can be any number of activities. And one of the more unique ones that I really love is something called laughter yoga. And it sounds ridiculous and crazy, but kids love it. Frankly, adults love it. And it's just a great way to bring our minds, to bring our focus into the present, which essentially what mindfulness is, just being present in the moment. So if you're willing, I can't see you, so we're on an honor system, but if you're willing, if you'll stand up, I'm standing up because I've been sitting all day. So I moved to a standing desk. So you might see me like moving around a lot. But if you're willing to stand up, kind of shake it out a little bit, I'm going to walk you through a mindfulness laughter yoga exercise. The three crucial ingredients of laughter yoga is laughter, clapping, breathing, and just having fun. And not judging yourself, not being overly sensitive about what people think. It doesn't matter who's looking through your window, it doesn't matter who's home with you, kind of just being present, being in the moment and enjoying yourself. So if you'll stand up with me, the first thing we're going to do is just a few deep breaths. And with your inhale, every time you inhale, I just ask you to do a really, really deep inhale and bring your arms up to the sky. And then with the exhale, laugh it out and drop your arms. And we're gonna do that 2 more times. So a big, deep inhale, lifting your arms up to the sky, holding it, and then dropping your hands and laughing down. And last time, inhale up, and then laughing it down. So this laughter yoga exercise is something called laughter cell phone. So this is essentially, we're going to pretend that someone is calling us and they just told us something really funny. And probably many of us have not gotten very funny phone calls in the last couple of months. So you can use your hand. If you have your phone nearby, you can pick up your phone. And honestly, I would just like you to pretend like you answered the phone and just start laughing. And it's ridiculous, but I'll talk about the point of it all in a second. So again, pretend like you just answered your phone, hello, and just start laughing. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. And then share, pretend like someone's in the room with you. All right, hopefully I wasn't the only person doing that and other people actually participated. So one of the reasons I love laughter yoga, and you can have a seat if you need to take some deep breaths, shake it out, feel free. If you want to keep standing, absolutely feel free. So one of the reasons I love laughter yoga is because our bodies don't know the difference between forced, ridiculous laughter where someone's kind of making you laugh into a phone or actual real laughter. The joy that comes, the increase in endorphins, the relaxation that comes, the deep breaths, the diaphragmatic breathing, meaning using the full expansion of your lungs, that happens no matter if you're really laughing and you get that like belly hurt laughter, or if it's forced, and you still get the same benefits. And so if any of you are teachers, I would strongly encourage you to go onto YouTube and search laughter yoga. It was actually created by a physician from India who recognized all of the benefits of laughter and kind of incorporated it into a worldwide phenomenon. So hopefully everyone enjoyed that. So the first thing that I just want to establish, racism is trauma. Any form of racism is trauma. And understanding that trauma has significant negative impacts on the brains and bodies of both children and adults. And often when we think about trauma, I think we often consider, major catastrophes or the loss of a loved one or physical or emotional or sexual abuse. And those are absolutely all traumatic experiences. But discrimination, bias, racism, our brains and bodies respond in the exact same way to mental and physical abuse and discrimination as it does to, physical abuse in childhood. And so what happens when we experience trauma? You go into fight, flight, or freeze. So our brain, it makes sense. When we're threatened, when our livelihood is threatened, when we don't feel safe, our brain goes into survival mode. So essentially what that means is that the lower functioning parts of our brain, the most rudimentary early parts of our brain, those are the parts of the brain that take over. The blood flow gets moved from the front of our brain, which is the critical thinking, executive functioning part of our brain, to the survival part. So the survival part of our brain, this is the brainstem and the limbic system. This is the part of our brain that tells our heart to beat and tells us to breathe and tells us to go into fight, flight, or freeze if something dangerous happens. And it makes sense because if a lion were chasing you right now, it wouldn't be useful for you to be able to process or think about how to solve a math problem or process some complex problem. In that moment, you need to figure out how to survive. And as we develop and in urgent situations, that's what keeps us alive. However, if you're someone that's constantly feeling threatened because, for example, you're a student of color in a predominantly white community and you don't feel safe or you feel threatened, or like me, I worry about my husband when he goes jogging alone as a Black man in Boston. There was just recently an incident that was on the news where apparently ICE stopped a Black man on the street. And reading that article and thinking about my husband going jogging immediately put me into survival mode. I felt my muscles tense. I felt my heart rate increase. I was not able to think clearly. The downside of survival mode in situations like this is that over time, our brains and our bodies don't know when we're safe and when we're not safe. And so when students or children are coming into our schools and they've experienced significant trauma, or they've experienced trauma in their home, or they're coming from communities with high violence, or they're running into situations where they feel like they're being profiled, they are walking into school highly traumatized in survival mode. When you are in survival mode, you cannot learn effectively. You cannot think clearly when you are trying to survive in a classroom setting. So imagine you're a student, you walked into school, someone says something offensive to you, or someone makes a derogatory statement, or you're coming from a community where there's high poverty or high violence, or maybe you didn't have enough to eat. And you sit down in the classroom, you're on edge, you're in fight, flight, or freeze, you're in survival mode, and a teacher immediately asks you to finish a math problem. You don't respond. Then they demand that you finish the math problem. Your reaction to that teacher may seem completely out of proportion. But again, you're in survival mode. So when you're in that state, the pervasive part of your brain that's working is the survival part. The cognition part is not working. So then immediately that teacher labels that student, labels that child, and sends them off to the principal's office. And then in that situation, nothing was gained. That child continues to feel on edge, continues to feel unsafe, and they're not learning, and the teacher wasn't able to support them. And so again, when we're overly stressed or in that survival state, logic no longer influences emotion. You literally cannot experience extreme emotion and be able to utilize your higher brain functioning. Children with toxic stress live their lives in this state of fight, flight, or freeze. They're unable to concentrate. They respond to the world as if it's a place of constant danger. They don't trust the adults around them. They have difficulty developing and keeping healthy relationships with peers. They live essentially in a state of terror. Oftentimes, when a child is in that fight, flight, or freeze and they have an explosion or they shut down, we'll ask them after the fact, and sometimes they won't even remember the conflict because they essentially lost control, again, of that higher functioning. And then we'll often, these children, instead of getting support, particularly if they're children of color, get labeled as deviant or withdrawn or disobedient or defiant. Black children and Latino children not only experience trauma in our country as a whole and in our communities, but they are also experiencing trauma in the school environment. Despite exhibiting some of the same behaviors, Black children receive harsher discipline and are less likely to be referred for additional supports. Black children are 3 times as likely as white students to receive expulsion or suspension for the exact same behaviors. And many of these behaviors are quite subjective, like being disrespectful or acting out. And again, the teacher is kind of making that determination about what warrants suspension or expulsion, but they're listed as the exact same behaviors. Black students make up about 18% of preschool enrollment, and these are 3- and 4-year-olds, but receive 48% of out-of-school suspensions. 70% of the students referred to law enforcement from school are Black and Latino. And as we'll talk about, not only are Black children disciplined more harshly and more frequently, but Black and Latino students are also less likely to be screened for gifted programs. And one of the things that a lot of schools across our country have implemented are these zero tolerance policies. And I cannot emphasize enough, zero tolerance are not trauma informed. If anything, they lead to increased trauma, reactivation of trauma, or exacerbating existing trauma. Zero tolerance policies lead to discriminatory and racist practices against children of color and children with disabilities. These are the pictures in front of you are pictures of situations that have occurred in the news over the last couple of years. There was a 9-year-old boy who was arrested because he wouldn't put away his fidget spinner. A 6-year-old girl who was arrested for having a tantrum. At the very end, a 9-year-old boy who was arrested for having a behavioral outburst who suffers from autism. In the third picture is a young girl who was in a fight, and 90-some pound teenage girl, 4 police took her down and she was arrested. And it's important to recognize that this trauma-informed information, becoming a trauma-informed school, becoming trauma-sensitive or anti-racist cannot just be for teachers. Every individual that has contact with a student should understand this principle, should be working towards becoming trauma-informed and anti-racist. Because the resource officer, that interaction impacts a child's behavior in school, impacts their success. The janitor, the administrative assistant, all of those interactions can have an impact on a child. And as we know, the zero tolerance leads to the school-to-prison pipeline. A single suspension in the first year of high school doubles the dropout chance. And if we funnel children into the school-to-prison pipeline, we are then impacting their trajectory and matriculation for the rest of their life because now they have a record. And some of you may recognize this picture. This was an article in the Boston Globe a few months ago. And the article essentially talked about many families of color, primarily only families of color, were being referred to Department of Children and Family Services because the children weren't logging on to virtual learning. And this was last year. According to the article, about 30% of students statewide did not sign on consistently to virtual learning. However, the majority, if not all, of the calls to DCF were for families of color. And when families of color are reported to DCF, again, for the same concerns, Black and Latino children are at much greater risk of being removed from their homes and put in foster care. And so again, when we're thinking about discrimination and racism, thinking about our disciplinary practices, what is the outcome? What are you looking to achieve by making that phone call to DCF about a child not signing on if you haven't already contacted the family, if you haven't made any advancement in connecting with the parent or the child? And now, of course, after DCF has called on these families for the child not signing on, that relationship is dissolved. And so we really have to think about what's going on with our families, what's going on with these students, and could there be more happening behind the scenes? Discipline is not always the only answer. In fact, it shouldn't even be the first answer in many situations. So this is a great video, and I have two videos, and both of them are from the perspective of children. I think it's always powerful for us to hear directly from our students. So if you have any issue hearing it, please let me know. Hopefully this is working.
Students are the ones going through it. Like, we're constantly getting kicked out of class, we're getting suspended, we're getting referrals for things that may not be our fault. It's failing us. Like, if we're here to learn, if you're not being able to teach us and we're not being able to learn, that's like failing us. Like, if you're suspended, a lot of teachers won't give you the homework that you need from the stuff that you missed. We're constantly getting pushed back and falling into the school-to-prison pipeline. Like, we're becoming a statistic, and that's not what we want to be. Not in a good way. Like, we're becoming the X% that's getting suspended and expelled and pushed out, and we don't get to be taught and actually learn. A lot of students, like, because came late to school, they're like, you know what, I'm late, I'm just not gonna go.
It pushes you further away from graduating. Like, you missing a lot of days, then you have to come in and make up work, and then you off topic.
I've got suspended for a fight that I wasn't even a part of. It puts a lot of stress on you.
I had got punished for not wearing a tie to school. It made me feel like, why am I even bothering coming? Like, if you just want to send me home based on the test. It just made me feel like pathetic.
It's frustrating because nobody digs deeper into it. It's like, oh, I'm worried about, I have all this other stuff on my brain. I'm supposed to focus in on the class.
I've been in the 9th twice and the 12th twice. I have surgery on my spine, scoliosis. I'm still going under surgery. They trying to just straighten my spine out with a cage and rods, and like, I don't even supposed to be walking, but like, I'm trying to make an effort to just go get my education.
You want to be able to be comfortable in your school, like, because you have 1,200 officers at your front gate. You may be physically safe, but emotionally you're not safe. Like, you feel completely uncomfortable.
Make your school safe. Make people feel like they want to be there. Sometimes it hasn't been easy for me to go back to school after being in situations as far as fighting and stuff like that.
I think restorative justice practices are really important. Like, it's been proven that they work.
I think that they need to sit down and actually talk to the kids and figure out what's going on and, you know, what happened for you to do this or make this decision. Inside they're begging for help, but they don't know how to say it out loud. I think everybody just needs a little bit of love, support, caring, so that you care, and they'll be all right.
Just make sure that you have these conversations more about the people being directly affected by it, and actually don't just listen, do something about it. Like, take it back and utilize it properly, and it does matter because I'm the one being affected by it.
So thinking about kind of the impact of trauma, understanding that when a child experiences trauma, acute trauma, or even chronic trauma that gets reactivated in the school setting because of negative experiences that they have with peers or with teachers, it impacts thinking, it impacts concentration, it impacts the student's ability to learn, but there are also significant long-term effects of racial trauma and being the victim of racism. And so this chart is a great chart that kind of in detail summarizes what racism does to the brains and bodies of children. And again, any type of racism, excuse me, bullying, seeing your parent or peer experience racism, there have been studies that show Black people and Black children who watch videos of other Black people being murdered in race-related violence experience that event as if they were there, as if it were happening to them. And this is why I always tell people, I don't watch the news and I do not watch social media videos of innocent Black people being murdered. It is not helpful, it is harmful, and even though if you're not aware of it, it is sticking with you. Trauma is cumulative, meaning that what happens to our students and our children when they were 6 or 7 is laying the foundation and is building on the trauma that they will experience as teenagers and adults. And every time we watch one of these videos or on the 24-hour news cycle and it gets looped over and over and over again, we are internalizing that pain and it is leading to an increased stress response. So what does an increased stress response mean? It increases our cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone. It increases heart rate, blood pressure. It leads to muscle tension and stiffness. It increases anxiety. Chronic stress leads to chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation leads to chronic disease. And if you're not familiar, I would strongly recommend looking into adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And there's a website called ACEs So High, where you can actually take a test and look at your own ACE score, adverse childhood experiences, and see your own risk factors. So essentially, what we know, the more risk factors or negative experiences that you had as a child, the greater the risk of chronic disease later in life. Racism being one of those adverse childhood experiences. Domestic violence, living in poverty, food insecurity, housing insecurity, foster care, bullying, all of those things are ACEs. The more ACEs you have, the greater the risk of chronic disease. African Americans and Latinos overall have a significantly higher ACE score than white Americans. An ACE score of 4 or more increases your risk of diabetes, obesity, heart disease, hypertension. An ACE score of 6 or more increases the risk that your life expectancy will be reduced by 20 years. It is no coincidence that many of these chronic diseases like hypertension, diabetes, obesity are the reason that Black and Latino people, are part of the reason that Black and Latino people are dying at much higher rates of COVID. Many of these ACEs are secondary to systemic and structural racism, as well as individual racism and negative experiences. We can certainly think about long-term, again, chronic illness, but even right now, Black children are suffering. Black children are dying at increasingly higher rates of suicide. This is due to a combination of factors: increased rates of unrecognized, misdiagnosed, and untreated mental illness, the burden of racism and prejudice, the school-to-prison pipeline. And one study that I've read, actually a few studies I've read that I found to be interesting and almost disheartening. Socioeconomic status does not decrease the risk of depression and suicide for Black children. Actually, the more money a Black family has, the greater the risk that the children will experience depression and possibly suicide. Why? Because the more money Black families have, the greater the risk that they'll be in an environment where they're one of the only people of color. The student will likely be in an environment where they're one of the only students of color in their classroom. They're at greater risk for discrimination. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is the most common disorder among African American and Latinos because of discrimination and racism. So this is not just an educational issue. This is not even just a long-term issue. Racism is a life or death issue for children of color, and we have to treat it as such. We have to treat it with a level of urgency, but it can't just be a hashtag. So my fear is that everyone's interested in talking about race and racism right now, but will they be next year? Will they be 2 years from now? This has to be a long-term commitment. This has to be a 5, 10+ year strategic plan for every institution. This can't just be you create a nice anti-racist statement and then you never actually follow through on it. And when we're thinking about the different types of the more covert forms of racism, I'm sure we've all heard of implicit bias. So implicit bias is not the kind of racial slur. This is not a swastika drawn on a bathroom wall. These are more insidious forms of racism. And actually, what we know are implicit biases and microaggressions can actually be more damaging than the overt forms of racism, because if someone calls you a racial slur, everybody around you knows that that was racism and you receive support. If someone keeps mistaking you for that one other student of color in your class, or they never really make an effort to pronounce your name correctly, people can argue that maybe that wasn't racism. Oh, you're overreacting. And then that leaves you both having been the victim of racism, starting to doubt and question yourself and be unsupported. And so it's important to recognize that we all have biases. It just is what it is. We live in a world where everyone has biases, and frankly, a lot of the media and what we see on TV reinforces those biases. I remember a while ago, I saw this Dove ad, and many of you may have seen it. There was a darker skinned Black woman with a brown shirt on, and the ad said, talked about using Dove and getting clean. And so as she used Dove, she pulled her shirt off and she turned into a fair skinned white woman with a beige shirt. The implication being that you were dirtier when you were brown and you used Dove and now you're clean. And they're just, whether or not we even recognize it, there's so much bias. And imagine being a child and seeing that. I remember watching with I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, and we were going through the Disney Channel looking at some of the movies that were available. And so we were watching Snow White. And the movie talked about how Snow White was the fairest woman in the land because her skin was white as snow and her lips were, red as a rose or something. And my 6-year-old said to me, he said, "Mommy, does that mean that only girls who have skin that's white as snow, are those the only girls who are pretty?" And it never even occurred to me the message that was being conveyed. And when I looked through the cartoons that were around during that time, the emphasis was the paler you were, the whiter you were, the more beautiful you were. And so these biases start at a very, very young age. If you have time, I would recommend going onto YouTube and looking at the doll study. Anderson Cooper redid it a couple years ago, where it essentially asked children to label dolls from Black to white as whether they were good or bad. And starting as young as 3 or 4, children already have negative biases against Black people just based on what they see in the world. And again, bias does not just lead to disciplinary practices being vastly unequal. It also leads to the lack of positive and supportive relationships with teachers that put children of color at a disadvantage. These subtle differences can affect a student's self-esteem, their motivation, and academic performance. Researchers have actually found correlations between a teacher's implicit bias and the racial ethnic achievement gap exhibited in the teacher's classroom. Whether or not you believe in your student impacts their performance. Studies have shown when Black students have Black teachers, they do better. And one of the reasons is because Black teachers tend to encourage and believe in Black students more than white teachers. And so when we're thinking about implicit bias, this means being very intentional about encouraging all of your students. This is a great quote. "If a teacher believes in their student and expects them to succeed, it impacts the student's performance." And there are numerous studies that support that. And now thinking about another kind of insidious form of racism, these are microaggressions. And I'm sure many of you have heard of the term microaggressions. And if you're interested in learning more about implicit biases, I would strongly recommend going to the Harvard Implicit Association test, or Harvard IAT. You can Google it. It's a free test that you can take online. It's by no means perfect, but it certainly opens the discussion around biases. And I always challenge people to take the one test that you don't want to know the answer to. So if you're afraid to acknowledge or admit your racial biases, you need to take the test on race. If you're afraid to acknowledge or face your religious biases, you need to take the test on various religions. So, you know, again, a part of becoming anti-racist is acknowledging your own bias and being willing to work on it. Excuse me. And so microaggressions are essentially these experiences that are kind of, they subtly happen throughout the day. Dr. Chester Pierce, who is a psychiatrist from Mass General, who I was very fortunate to learn from before he passed away, actually coined the term microaggressions. He described them as subtle blows delivered incessantly, or death by 1,000 cuts. And as a person of color, you can relate to this. So these are 3 types of microaggressions. So for example, a micro invalidation, these are these communications that kind of subtly exclude, negate, or nullify excuse me, the thoughts or feelings of a person of color. So a student says, you know, I really feel like I was discriminated against. I feel like the teacher's treating me unfairly. I feel like these students are targeting me. And if someone says, oh, that's not the case, you're overreacting, that's not really a problem, or a micro insult. I recently told someone that I was promoted to senior vice president of my company. And their response was, well, you know, it's because you're Black. No acknowledgement of my accomplishments, my career, my training. It's because you're Black. That was a blatant microaggression. Another microaggression that I hear often is, oh, I'm colorblind. I don't see color. No such thing. Color is a part of who we are. When a white person, even when they're well-intentioned, says they don't see color, that means they're intentionally negating a part of who I am, or who that person of color is. And these are great quotes that actually are from teachers. By not seeing a student's race, teachers are not seeing the full student. This notion of color blindness leads to all white spaces. A translation for I don't see race: I'm going to use my place of privilege to refute and deny the sufferings of those who do not have white privilege, while at the same time erasing their personal and cultural history. I won't really get into the term white privilege, but if we have time at the end, I'm happy to answer that. I know that's a very loaded term, and it can be challenging for some people. When I think about white privilege, I always use the example. I'm from Philadelphia originally, and I got a scholarship in high school and went to a private high school. It was about 2 hours away from my house, and I had to wear stockings. When I went to the local CVS, there were no stockings in my color, in my skin color. So if I had to buy stockings, I had to buy stockings that were much lighter than mine. In order to get stockings, I had to wait for the 2-hour ride back home. And even then, sometimes it was hard to find stockings even in my own community. So white privilege is just something like not having to worry about where you can find stockings that match your skin color. But again, I'm happy to discuss that more. And so now what? I just delivered a lot of not so great news. Where do we go from here? One, children are just incredible, right? They're resilient, they're awesome, they grow, they learn, they recover. So healing is possible. I work with highly traumatized children who have been through some of the most horrific experiences you could ever imagine, and I have seen kids recover. I still, even to this day, get emails and messages from parents or foster families or children who I worked with 10 years ago to say, like, guess what, I'm in nursing school, or guess what, I'm going to be a social worker, I'm going to be a teacher, I'm going to change other kids' lives. So it's possible. But what needs to happen? Number one, we need to understand what it means to be trauma informed and trauma sensitive, and we'll talk about that. Recognizing that children cannot heal if they don't feel safe. So in order to help a child heal, we have to create a safe and supportive environment with safe and supportive adults. Meaning that if you're working with students of color and you are not a person of color, you need to make sure that they trust you and that you connect with them and that you are checking your bias and your privilege so that these students feel safe. When we're thinking about becoming trauma informed, understanding that being anti-racist is being trauma informed. If you are not doing both, you are not truly becoming trauma informed. If you ever have time, Dr. Bruce Perry is a phenomenal child psychiatrist who wrote a book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. And this is one of the quotes from his book. The more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely he will be to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. And that's actually true. Studies have shown that one of the biggest difference when they're looking at kids who recover from trauma and kids who don't, one of the biggest differences is that kids who recover from trauma have an adult in their lives who love them unconditionally and supports them. And so when we're thinking about how to support our students, one of the first things I emphasize is taking a strengths-based approach. We tend to measure all students with one test and with one scale and one measurement, and that just doesn't work. Not everyone learns the same, not everyone has the same strengths. And I love this quote from Albert Einstein: everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. So many of our students think because they don't do well on the MCAS that they're not exceptional, that they won't be able to achieve success in life. And that's simply not true. We just haven't used a tool or haven't found their strengths. We have to value our students. We have to work to individuate and find out what makes each student special. We have to stop defining children by what they can't do or their deficits and start defining them by what they can do and their successes. Successful people achieve excellence by developing their talents and their strengths. A strength perspective assumes that every individual has resources that they can mobilize towards success. And again, everybody defines success differently. So that means when we're working with students, we're making an effort to label what is right about them, label what is good about them. As educators, we can personalize the learning experience by practicing, again, individualization, and by individualizing, we actually decrease the risk of stereotyping. And implicit bias, again, is based on stereotypes. And so when we individuate and we're looking at students and focusing on who they are and what makes them unique, we're not using implicit biases, we're not stereotyping them and lumping them in with whatever we think about a certain race or gender or ethnicity. And actually studies have shown that positive expectations, again, of students helps to improve their academic performance. It actually, studies have shown that it increases the rates of matriculation, it increases the rates of graduation, and even within months of changing and looking at a more strengths-based perspective, students' grades improve. And a part of being strengths-focused and acknowledging who a child is also acknowledging their ethnicity and their race. Studies have shown that self-love and ethnic appreciation helps to strengthen children and give them the confidence to buffer themselves against the negative impact of racism. So you may have seen these hashtags, Black Boy Joy or Black Girl Magic or Black is Beautiful. They're hashtags, but they also have significant meaning. So often Black girls walk around being told that they're not pretty enough, or that the European standard of beauty is pretty and that that's not who they are. But if they're able to internalize these phrases like Black Girl Magic and Black Boy Joy and Black is Beautiful, it actually helps them to do better in school, be more confident in who they are, and not internalize the racial trauma that can happen on a regular basis. And so what does that mean in the education setting? That means when we're thinking about who we put on the wall, the pictures of success. When we're looking at who we consider our heroes, Black people should not be relegated to Black History Month. Latino and Hispanic people should not be relegated to Hispanic Heritage Month. When we're discussing who we value and the virtues and talents we value, we have to make sure that they're representative of all of the students in our class. And even if you only have white students in your class, these students need to also see success and value from people of color. So one microaggression that often happens that we don't think about are environmental microaggressions. So that means when I walk into a building, do I feel safe in that building? Do any of the pictures on the walls look like me? Does this feel like a welcoming environment based on the statements that I hear people saying, or the posters that are on the wall? When I walk into the classroom, are any of the books written by Black authors? Are any of the books from authors from different countries? When we are discussing history, is Black history slavery, and is that only 2 pages? Or is Black history only Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks? Are we willing to acknowledge other people in Black history that have done incredible things? And so when we're thinking about becoming anti-racist, it's not just what we do as an individual, it's an entire culture change. It's an environmental change. A great quote from an educator, her name is Dr. Rita Pearson. She says, kids don't learn as well from people they don't like. So to improve relationships, decrease a student's feeling of being ostracized, targeted, or misplaced, increase that student's connectedness, again, understanding that a strong relationship with a student can make the biggest difference in the world, we have to ensure that the number of positive interactions with a child outweighs the number of negative interactions. Many students will feel like that is not the case for them. And so there are different ways that we can increase the number of positive interactions. One is a technique called reflective listening. So reflective listening essentially is listening to understand, not listening to reply. Meaning that if someone's telling you a story, if a student's communicating with you, you're not just waiting to give them an answer, you're not waiting to provide a solution, you are listening to everything that they're saying, and before you answer, you're summarizing what they told you. Okay, so it sounds like you're telling me, it seems like what you're telling me is this, and it sounds like you're very frustrated or very angry that you were punished for not doing your math homework, but what you're telling me is that you didn't really understand it and you asked for help and you didn't feel like you got that support. Did I get that right? And you would be amazed at the reaction that you get from children when you simply just summarize what they told you. They feel heard, they feel validated, they feel listened to, and it's even better if you can identify the emotion that you think you're hearing, because many students don't really have that emotional vocabulary. So one way to increase positive interactions, just listen and reflectively listen and summarize what they've told you. Other things you can do, use a kid's name or their preferred pronouns. Asking children what their preferred pronouns are, writing that down, remembering it, and using those. Making sure that you pronounce a child's name correctly and being intentional about using that name and saying it the right way. A positive interaction could also just be, a positive morning greeting. Hey, good morning, Nicole. I am so excited to work with you today. Good morning, Nicole. I cannot wait for us to complete this work together. Acknowledging their strengths. Wow, you know what? Answering that question in front of all your peers, that took a lot of courage and that was really difficult. Thank you for doing that. Even nonverbal interactions, my 4-year-old every day kind of gives me like a thumbs up and a wink. And when I walk by and I see him doing his work or virtual learning, I give him a thumbs up and a wink. And sometimes like he has his head down, I could tell he's not interested, and I give him a thumbs up and a wink, or 2 thumbs up, or I give him a silent clap and he perks up. So even something as simple as that can impact. So again, 5 to 1, 5 positive interactions to 1 negative interaction is what students need to help build resilience. Every interaction is an opportunity. And so now when we're thinking about, it's almost 5:50, so I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So when we're thinking about becoming anti-racist, there's 3 things that we have to think about. And again, this is barely scratching the surface. In order to address racism, we need to be able to identify it. We need to be able to speak up against it. And we need to change the circumstances that created it. And when I think about racism, I created these lists and I kind of put racism in 3 categories. There's the societal and structural racism. So these are the big racism. This is kind of what has trickled down and caused everything else. And to impact that, we have to think about voting, and we have to think about policy changes, and we have to think about how education is set up in our state and how that leads to disparities. You know, which schools have ventilation systems and which don't. Which schools, their whole ventilation system is simply opening a windows, whereas schools in wealthier communities redid their entire air conditioning system. And so clearly those students are at an advantage. Let's look at where the money is going. Looking at police reform, what schools have resource officers and what schools don't? Are those resource officers trained in anti-racism and trauma education? All of these policies that are put in place lead to increased racism and trauma. Then we're thinking about institutional racism. So looking at your school, what things exist in your school that perpetuate racism, discrimination, and bias? This list, of course, is not exhaustive, and I would certainly recommend adding to it. But asking your students, what does a safe classroom look like for you? Specifically, asking your students of color, what would make you feel safe in this school? What is happening in this school right now that does not allow you to feel safe? Being willing to have a conversation about racism and supporting people of color, explicitly supporting people of color, both staff and students. Prioritizing professional development around race, racism, and trauma in the same way you prioritize professional development around math, science, MCAS. It is a part of the curriculum, and it is intentionally put there because we prioritized it. Making sure that the staff who are doing this diversity and inclusion work are being paid for it. We're not asking them to volunteer. We're not minimizing the work and the commitment. This is exhausting work. It is exhausting right now to be a person of color in America. It is exhausting. It's exhausting to be asked to do this work and not be compensated for it. And so, you know, again, the leadership has made a commitment. There's a financial commitment, and staff are committed to it. And it's not just people of color doing this work. And then on a personal level, if you are looking to become an ally, or if you are a person of color and people ask you, well, what do I do? Like, how can I become anti-racist? Again, certainly starting with the Harvard Implicit Association test, taking the IAT, doing some self-reflection, be comfortable being uncomfortable. So, you know, I was thinking about this the other day. As a person of color, you recognize when you were that race. So people, you know, I was having this conversation with my mom. When did I know that I was Black? And I had to know that I was Black very early on because my mom and I had a conversation about what to do and what not to do in stores, because I don't want people to accuse me of things. And I learned that very early when I was 5, because we were walking around a store and someone was following us. And that's when I recognized that my Blackness means something in this country. When you ask a white person, when did you realize you were white? Usually that's much later, because you don't necessarily have to acknowledge or recognize whiteness. So Toni Morrison has this quote, and I always mess it up. She said, to be American is white, everyone else has to hyphenate. And if you think about it, when we say American, we tend to think about white people. Everyone else is African American, Asian American, Hispanic American. American means white. And so that often when you're thinking about addressing anti-racism, it means that you now have to think about what that means, what that whiteness means. What does it mean to be white in America? What privilege does that give you? What power do you hold, and how can you utilize that power to support people around you? This is just a list I created about things that we should think about when we're trying to become a trauma-sensitive school. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but it's certainly things that many of us are already doing, but it's important to think about. And again, I'll make sure that I share these slides with you so that you have this list. So, and we, you know, again, we'll stop there. This just kind of the summary is, this is not enough, right? Like, we're barely scratching the surface. As you can just see from the pain in Iris's face, this is happening every day to so many of our students. And so we have to be willing to do a lot. more. And these are just resources that I would strongly recommend for understanding and becoming more trauma informed. The Massachusetts Advocate for Children, Helping Traumatized Children Learn, is a great resource. They have an incredible website with a lot of resources. This was a tweet that I did in September, and it went viral, and I wasn't expecting it. I commented on what a teacher told me after doing some trauma-informed trainings and how it changed the way she approached students. And I was shocked at the number of messages I got from people saying, like, why isn't this a thing that everyone does? And if my teacher would have done that for me, I would have had a completely different educational experience. I mean, like, my inbox was flooded with adults who were wishing that this had been their experience. And this, again, is a statement from UCSF School of Medicine that I think really encompasses what it means to both be anti-racist and trauma-informed. And I'll send that again and you can read that. And then I'll just end with this quote. The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself, and it's the only way forward. Thank you.
Nicole, I think I represent everyone's feelings. I cannot thank you enough for that presentation. I think you've held everyone spellbound with information and the way you've presented it. And I know we have time for, a few minutes for questions. And, the one question that I've seen, and if others have questions, please post them into the chat. It can be so awkward to begin the conversation in a school around racism. You have most white people get defensive, that whole white fragility piece and whatnot. Do you have any suggestions about how one can successfully initiate having real conversations about racism in a school?
So I would say one of the first things I would recommend is talking to your students. Many private schools, I don't know if you've seen on Instagram, there've been a lot of accounts, so Black at whatever school. So I went to a school called Shipley in Philadelphia, and there's a Black at Shipley account. I went to Villanova right outside of Philadelphia, and there's a Black at Villanova account. And all of these accounts are students basically pouring out their pain, and there's just so much trauma. And so if you really want to start this conversation, you can't manage what you don't measure. And so it's really hard to address the problems in your school if you're not looking for them. So one thing, asking students, polling students, doing focus groups, and getting an understanding from them about what their experiences are and what they feel like needs to be changed. Because trauma removes your power and it makes you feel helpless. By asking students and involving them, we're helping to empower them. So that's one thing. The second thing is also looking at your numbers, looking at the disciplinary numbers in schools. Yeah. How many students of color are being suspended compared to how many white students? Who gets referred to the principal's office? Even if you wanted to be more specific, looking at classrooms. Last year, how many students from X teacher's classroom got referred to the principal's office or got suspended? And what was the race of those students? Who gets referred for IEPs? Who gets referred to the counselor? And who gets suspended? And so, having that data, I think a lot of people who are not interested in learning about race or racism, they need to see the hard facts. They need to see the data. And so collecting that information, having that data is a great place to start. But then also asking if students are willing, asking them to talk to the adults. Tell us about your experiences. What's some of the pain that you've experienced without facing repercussions? Asking our colleagues and our peers if they feel safe and comfortable. Are they willing to have this conversation? But also making it mandatory for teachers to do this work on their own. This is not just a Black problem. This is not just a Latino problem. This is an everyone problem. And people of color were not the people that started racism. And so the burden can't just be on people of color to fix it. And so when you're doing a book club or you're having readings for teachers, these readings also need to encompass anti-racist readings. If you go on my website, wellmindsconsulting.com, under resources, I have a couple of different handouts that I've collated. One of them is an anti-racist handout. And the first part is for people who have experienced racism, and it has resources. The remainder of the document, it's like 4 or 5 pages, are videos and books and articles kind of broken up into sections for people to read. And the work has to start, but again, the leadership needs to emphasize that this is important to us. This is a requirement, and then the individuals also have to do the work.
Thank you, Nicole. Other questions? Patricia, Sal?
Another question came in that asked if you would speak to creating trauma-sensitive schools for younger students.
Mm-hmm. I mean, absolutely. So trauma, and Joe, I'm sure you can even speak to this, thinking about some of the work that you've done, but trauma-sensitive work can start with children, young children. There doesn't have to be an age. So, one thing, again, that's very helpful is meditation and mindfulness. Mindfulness helps us to be in the moment. It decreases our stress response, and we tend to rely on stereotypes and implicit biases when we're stressed. And every teacher knows this. When you're overwhelmed and you're stressed, you tend to go to shortcuts, and you tend to cut corners because you just don't have the energy. And that same thing occurs for biases. When you're overwhelmed and you're stressed, you're more likely to engage in bias. And so working on managing our own stress, working on managing the stress of students. My now 6-year-old son, the first time he experienced racism, he was 3. And when he was 3 at a daycare, a 5-year-old girl told him that he should never wear red sneakers because it looked bad against his dirty brown skin, and his skin was ugly and it looked dirty and it was yucky. And at 3 years old, he came home and he was crying, and he took off his shoes and he threw them. He said, "Mommy, I'm never wearing red again. I hate red. My skin is ugly." And we both sat on the floor in front of our door and we just cried, because I'm like, how am I having this conversation at 3? And he doesn't, and again, trauma's cumulative. He doesn't remember that, but he doesn't like the color red. My 4-year-old, his favorite color is red. My 6-year-old, his favorite color is blue, and he doesn't like red. He doesn't know why, but that visceral reaction, that experience sat with him. And so if he can experience racism at 3, we can start to have discussions around anti-racism and acceptance at 3.
Yep. Thank you.
And there are plenty of books that are available. Ibram Kendi, who's now is either Boston University or Boston College, he and his wife are now here. He wrote a great children's book called Anti-Racist Baby. And he has he has a couple of books also around anti-racism. So there's even a great book. It's called Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together at the Lunch Table? And I know I'm butchering the title, but another great book to try to understand race and racism in the educational setting. I mean, the New York Times a couple months ago had like the top 10, and most of them were books around anti-racism, all fantastic. Yes, thank you. Why do all the Black kids sit together in the cafeteria? Thank you.
Yeah. So Nicole, again, I want to thank you so much for this presentation. If you go to the chat, you're going to see a tremendous number of thank yous, and it is truly heartfelt. Thanks a lot for coming and providing this important element of the work that we do. And look forward to continue to work with you in the ways that we do. And thanks again, everyone, for coming, and Nicole, for such a great presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.